So welcome everybody to this webinar. We're thrilled and very excited to share with you the launch of our 2021 policy brief. How do we know goals are achieved in early childhood education and care? And I have with me three wonderful panelists and authors of the policy brief that will share with you some thoughts around it. And to get us started, we are going to hear from Alejandra Cardini. She is director of the education program at CIPEC, the Center of Public Policy for Equity and Growth. And she's also co-chair of the Social Cohesion and the Future of Welfare Systems Task Force at the Think20. Welcome, Alejandra.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for this introduction. So let me start by sharing and celebrating that this is the fourth consecutive year in which education is in the G20 agenda and in the T20 discussions. It was first included in the Argentine presidency 4 years ago. And in these 4 years, we were able to build a very solid network to discuss education policy issues and also to provide recommendations. In these 4 years, more than 50 think tanks, research centers, and international agencies have participated of this process with more than 90 experts, and we have produced a total of 25 policy briefs in different topics related to digitalization, funding mechanisms, teacher training, gender in education, ed challenges, and early childhood. And this was one of the topics that was first included and continued being a very nodal topic during the 4 years. So let me begin by saying that these 2 years have been extremely challenging for education in general and for everyone. In this extremely challenging situation with education disruption and discontinuity in 2 academic years and still present in many countries, this is leading to a terrible education emergency that has no precedence, and it will have immediate effects and long-term effects on welfare, learning, earning opportunities, and life opportunities as well. So in this context, our task force has produced 3 policy briefs that deal with 3 very different and important topics. The first one, and I'm not going to be diving deeply into this one because I leave Mathias to tell you exactly how this topic is moving. But the third one looks at early childhood policies, particular education and information systems. And this is a very, very important topic. The second one is more related to education emergency and the necessary policies to deal with this situation. And we know here that inequalities will compound specifically on those in emergency and conflict zones, as well as those facing hardcore exclusion due to intersecting factors as gender, race, language, disability. So this particular policy brief talks to G20 countries, saying that education policies should focus on 4 areas: education financing, emergency digital distance learning, education management and information systems, and this is linked to the education policy, to the early childhood policy brief, and citizen engagement. And the third policy brief looks at learning losses, and here evidence also indicates that learning losses are disproportionately affecting children from lower socio-economical backgrounds and marginalized groups. And that specific policy brief talks about different examples of cost-effective policies to deal with learning losses. So curricular adaptations, teacher training programs, pedagogical practices. So it looks more to the pedagogical aspect of policies. So to close this brief introduction and invite you all to read these policy briefs in the T20 website, I could say that G20 countries face very difficult very difficult challenges today. One, on how to respond domestically to their own education emergency, but also on how they need to respond to mitigate those regional and country differences that the pandemic is having on education. So thank you very much, Jenny.
Thank you, Alejandra. So now we're going to hear from the lead author of the policy brief, Mathias Urban. Mathias is Desmond Chair of Early Childhood Education at the Early Childhood Research Center in Dublin City University. Welcome, Mathias.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Alejandra, for this wonderful introduction. It is quite remarkable, actually, to see the achievements of 4 years, starting with the Argentinian leadership to bring education and early childhood onto the G20 agenda. We're living in quite challenging times, as you say, and we're all aware that any instrument that we have for global multilateral coordination in these times of crisis are more than welcome and necessary. So I'm going to introduce the fruits of an international collaboration in the 4th year, an early childhood policy brief recommendations that builds on a long-standing collaboration in the area. This year in 2021, within the context of Task Force 6 of the T20, we are looking at the contribution of early childhood development, early childhood education, early child education and care to the future of welfare systems, specifically through the lens of information systems and data, and how do we know what we're doing is actually achieving what we are hoping to achieve. Just to give you some brief background, one of the backgrounds is not what we're seeing across the globe is that countries are increasingly adopting policy frameworks that address early childhood from a holistic perspective, and we have invited one of our panelists, Agatha, to actually give us some of these perspectives from a European point of view. So we have a number of examples around the world, starting with the country where I live and work at the moment. Ireland has given itself a whole of government strategy for young children. We have several examples from several South American countries, including Colombia, Uruguay, Chile. We have the European Union Quality Framework for Early Child Education and Care. We have India's Integrated Child Development Scheme. So they're emerging all over the world, and they urgently require new and effective ways of governing, resourcing, and of professional preparation in these systems. So it's not just about developing policies, developing what we call competent systems, but also underpinning them with knowledge, with holistic approaches to data, monitoring, evaluation, and they need to be connected. So there is a huge opportunity for shared learning and a necessity for shared learning across policy and practice initiatives around the globe, in the global south and the global north. This is a global collaboration, and I don't want to continue without drawing attention to the group behind this. So my privilege was to coordinate this group from several continents. Co-authors include our very own Dr. Jennifer Guevara, who moved to Dublin from Argentina, from CPEC, that's Center for the Implementation of Public Policies for Equity and Growth. We have a colleague from Colombia, Dr. Alejandro Acosta, working with us. We have the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries in India, Dr. Anand. We have Emily Vargas Baron working with us, hailing from the US. And Alejandra, the co-chair of the task force, is here with us today from CPEC as well. We have our colleague from Brazil, Dr. Claudia Costin. We have another colleague from the National University in Bogota, Colombia, Dr. Rita Flores Romero. We have the coordinator of the African Early Childhood Network in Kenya, Dr. Lynette Kengo. And last but not least, Dr. Dwi Priono, the director of the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization Regional Center for Early Childhood Education and Parenting in Indonesia, representing 28 Southeast Asian countries. So we're working within a global consensus based on a solid body of evidence. There is a broad global consensus that early childhood programs are beneficial to individual children, to societies, to communities, if they are of high quality. And the group of 20 has recognized this in their statements. And here's a quote from the T20 communique issued in Tokyo in 2019 that reminds us about the G20 commitment to advancing access to locally and culturally appropriate and quality early childhood development, early child education and care for all children from birth, and build international consensus on government responsibility for a whole systems approach to policies. These are important points. This is about governments quite often stepping back into that space, taking hands-on responsibility for developing whole systems around young children and families and communities. And this is increasingly important, not to leave this to a fragmentation of actors and fragmented interests. All this requires information and data. Over the years, this international group has produced a coherent body of evidence and policy guidance, starting with the process in Argentina in 2018, highlighting the importance of developing what we call integrated and competent systems for early childhood policies and practices. Moving into questions of governance in 2019 at the T20 hosted by Japan, early childhood development, early child education and care as a common good and public and government responsibility. In 2020, we focused on how to use and address experiences made at local level to upscale grassroots experiences, bring them up to scale, and how that can be done rather than by imposing one size fits all solutions. But of course, also given the global situation, the policy brief talking about how to increase resilience of early child education care systems in the context of crisis and disruption. We're moving into the space of integrated and multisectoral early childhood data monitoring and evaluation systems today. And we are looking forward to moving on to the G20 presidency of Indonesia in 2022, where we look forward to continuing our global collaboration in the policy space of early childhood development and early child education and care. And this has been thrown into very sharp relief during the last 2 years, mentioned by Alejandra. We've seen, and countries have learned quite often the hard way, that early child education is a common good, it's an essential service, it's critical for the functioning of the societies, and is a critical support mechanism for children, for families, for communities, and for entire countries and economies. We do also know that children and their families are quite often the most vulnerable in these crisis scenarios that we're seeing, and there are converging crises: the pandemic, the crisis of biodiversity, the crisis of democracy, and all this sort of converging on children. But what we also see, and there is first emerging evidence that countries with more advanced information systems that actually talk to each other across different silos are much better prepared to meet the challenges and the uncertainties arising from these local and global crises. And this is what our policy brief is about. We have, looking globally, at least 76 countries that have adopted multisectoral ECD, ECEC policy frameworks. So we're not only beginning to do this. The policies are emerging around the globe. We have seen the inclusion of early childhood in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which is very important because it is not just about realizing SDG 4.2, the target about having access to high quality early childhood programs for each and every child, but also about early childhood as an enabler for achieving the entire SDG framework. So data monitoring evaluation systems contribute to establishing and maintaining these effective social welfare systems and early childhood systems. But they only do that if they are well designed, appropriately resourced, and competently governed. So this is really what we're outlining in this policy brief and what we're presenting to policymakers at national and international level to frame fragmented information systems into ones that come together to support effective, efficient, equitable systems for all children and all families and all communities. So the policy recommendations in a nutshell in this brief are to design, develop, and implement national comprehensive and integrated multisectoral early childhood development, early child education care data monitoring and evaluation systems, link them to multisectoral early childhood policies. And what's crucial about this is that they have to report on and ensure the accountability and sustainability of what are quite often sectoral services and moving towards multisectoral integrated services and policy. This policy brief is about integrated and multisectoral early childhood monitoring data and evaluation systems. While connected, we use these terms, integrated and multisectoral, referring to quite distinct underlying concepts. So data monitoring evaluation systems must be multisectoral in order to create a comprehensive picture of the reality of young children, their families and communities, drawing on multiple sources of information with the aim of making them compatible. Constituting elements of the system, that is data collection, monitoring, evaluation, will also have to be integrated in order to enable meaningful interpretation, informed judgment, and democratic decision-making of all stakeholders. That means including all levels of the systems, including those at the center of the programs, children, families, and communities, not only as informants of data collection, but also in defining what actually matters to be monitored, and to use that as a constant systemic processual evaluation tool for the policies. Some of the key variables that need to sort of inform these systems, and we've talked about this in more detail in the actual document in the policy brief, is really sort of are around the entire life experience of young children, starting from birth, taking into account their living conditions, taking into account children's right to health, to social protection, but also to well-being, holistic development, and to education and care from birth, as enshrined in the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And all this needs to be incorporated into or connected to systems level information. We need disaggregated information on socioeconomic and sociocultural diversity of children, communities, and the early childhood workforce. We need children and families' transitions into and through the early childhood system monitored, including parental leave policies and transition to the compulsory school system. So it's a multi-dimensional construct that really so underpins every child's right to fulfill his or her potential, grounded in holistic development, understood as a common good and a shared responsibility. And when we come to shared responsibility, that takes us back to the earlier statement by the T20 in 2019. Governments have a specific responsibility in terms of coordinating at horizontal and vertical level, and to building these systems that actually inform each other. So governments are not necessarily the only actor in this field, but they are a central actor, and we're beginning to see that hands-off governance is no longer an option in this field. So I would like to sort of draw this to a close with an observation by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, who talks about perspectives on global development just very recently in this year, stating that discontent is rising around the world, reflecting dysfunctions and injustices that have emerged in economic, social, and political systems, also as a response to the damage humankind is inflicting on the world's natural systems and thus inevitably upon itself. And the COVID-19 pandemic exposed these effects to devastating effect, and we've seen the repercussions in the early childhood field around the globe. As countries plan their recovery from the multiple crises, the OECD states, triggered by the pandemic, they have an opportunity for these systems to be more inclusive, more sustainable, and more responsive. But this can only happen with the active participation of and collective action at the national, local, and international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mathias. It is actually quite an achievement across the 4 years, and it is also quite a challenge in terms of policy for the G20 countries and all the other countries in the global south and north. And to reflect on the implications of this policy brief on European policies, we have Agata Dadato. She is Senior Program Manager at Eurochild and Coordinator of First Year's First Priority Campaign. Thank you, Agata, for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for inviting Eurochild, the European Network of Children's Rights Organization, to contribute to this remarkable launch of the T20 policy brief. We've already heard how the pandemic has brought into sharp focus existing social inequalities and poverty in and across European countries and globally. We have also witnessed how the pandemic and its associated restrictions on movement and social interactions has negatively impacted children in Europe and globally, and they have been paying a high price. Thanks to our members, Eurochild documented what we observed last year through our Growing Up in Lockdown report. And this report also includes recommendations for improving public policies in the short and long term to support better outcomes for children and families. Knowing the importance of the first months and years of a child's life for healthy development, we're very, very concerned that parents and families are not getting the necessary support they need during this critical period of life. Millions of families face financial pressures, unemployment, discrimination, and all of this can impact parents' capacity to provide a healthy, nurturing environment for their very young children. The cost to individuals, families, communities, and society as a whole is huge. We really need to address childhood poverty if we are to successfully recover from this pandemic and build inclusive and resilient societies. As the policy brief highlights, there's real lack of data, evaluation, and monitoring systems that would shed light on how countries are performing with regards to early childhood development. We strongly support your call for multi-sector data collection. This is something we've been working on through the first year's first priority campaign, which Eurochild co-leads with the International Step-by-Step Association. The country profiles we have developed in the 9 European countries where the campaign operates includes data across 6 holistic dimensions: poverty, maternal and child health, safety and security, early learning, family support, and the level of cross-sectoral coordination for early childhood development. As we work at the level of the EU, we also strongly support the policy brief call for data and monitoring systems that are integrated vertically across multiple levels of administration. In light of the EU's recent adoption of the so-called European Child Guarantee Initiative, there's a need for more comprehensive monitoring across the EU. For example, we know that the EU is currently measuring participation rates in creche and childcare settings for under 3 years old and in preschool and kindergarten. But we truly think this is a very poor proxy for understanding how children are faring. While early childhood education and care are essential services, we must also be able to address their quality and learning outcomes, especially for those children growing up in disadvantaged situations. For countries in the European Union, the European Child Guarantee Initiative does offer a critical window of opportunity to trigger new investment and policy reform. The guarantee calls for more and better investment across 5 service areas: housing, health, education, childcare, and nutrition. Critically, it also calls for better integration of services and ensuring an enabling policy framework that reflects the needs of children and families in vulnerable situations. Policies and services that support early childhood development are an important piece of the puzzle. Through our first year's first priority campaign, we're looking at the needs of particular groups of children in need: those living in extreme poverty, those of ethnic minorities, including traveler communities and Roma, who face a long history of discrimination in the European context, but also those migrant and refugee families and children with disabilities. By working closely with organizations in 9 European countries, we're advocating for reforms for more cross-sectoral coordination of policies. And we are using the leverage of EU policy and funding to drive change. What we try to achieve through our campaign is scaling up what works and influencing national budgets in the long term. Again, let me really thank you for inviting Eurochild to contribute to this launch of the policy brief. We see far many synergies between our work, and we really look forward to working closely together in the coming months and years to ensure that early childhood development gets the attention it so deserves at political level. If you want to know more about our campaign or wider work advocating for the rights of children in Europe, please go to firstyearsfirstpriority.eu or to eurochild.org.
Thank you, Agatha. Thank you very much for those encouraging words. And thanks everyone for tuning in to this webinar. Please download, read, and share our policy brief. The link will be in the box below. Please also follow us on Twitter. We are at DCU_ECRC, and join our mailing list. And we'll leave a link to do that right below this video. Thank you very much, and see you soon.